This event this evening is the first event sponsored by the Institute since we announced its creation last spring. There are a lot of things that go on at a university, particularly in these days, where people pause and wonder, well, is that really important? Is that subject of work or research something that really needs to be going on? Is it worth our tax dollars? Is it worth our charitable dollars? Is it worth the commitment of the university? Now, I have to say, no one has asked that question about the study and advancement of religious tolerance. Talking earlier this evening to Milton, I remarked that if someone had said to me 30 years ago this was going to be one of the foremost problems of the world that needed all of the effort and attention that universities and others can bring to it, I frankly would have doubted that would have been the case as we sat at the beginning of the 21st century. And yet, undoubtedly, that is the case. And universities do have something to contribute to understanding, to intellectual understanding, to activity, to fostering understanding among our students, to encouraging them to go out in the world and make a difference in these areas, to bringing in people from our various communities with the hope at the beginning, if nothing else, that our communities here will set an example for the rest of the world and how communities of very different religious perspectives and backgrounds can get along with each other. So in that spirit, I welcome all of you this evening to begin this important work of the Boniek Institute, and I'd like for all of us to take a moment and thank Milton and Laurie for what they have contributed. Now, we're also pleased to have with us tonight institutes need leaders, and we wanted to get this institute off immediately, and so we started by appointing 2 interim directors of the Boniek Institute. Now, it sounds like maybe a joke, you know, a philosopher and a sociologist go into a room, and I don't know what actually comes out of that, but that's where we are. Doctors Elaine Howard Eklund and Donald Morrison, a sociologist and a philosopher, I think, bring to this institute, I think, unique qualities that are going to enable us to lay foundations that will serve us far into the future. Elaine Howard Eklund is the Herbert S. Autry Chair Professor of Sociology at Rice University. She's also the director of the Religion and Public Life Program and a Rice Scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. She's an enthusiastic and engaging scholar whose work spans the globe as she has sought insight into, among other things, scientists' engagement and experience with faith and religion. Her recent book, Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, has been highly acclaimed, and her ongoing research program promises to further illuminate the fruitful intersections between religious and scientific thought. Donald Morrison is professor of philosophy and classical studies and has affiliations with both ancient Mediterranean civilizations and medieval studies at Rice University. Specialist in ancient and political philosophy, Professor Morrison has been a Rockefeller Fellow at Princeton University Center for Human Values, a junior fellow of the Center for Hellenic Studies, and a visiting professor at the University of Paris 1 Sorbonne. Beyond his scholarly distinction, Don has also served the Rice community in very important ways, including as a residential associate at Sid Richardson's College, and I should say, as for the last 3 years, in a new position we created called Faculty Liaison to the President, in which he conveys the very important perspective of the faculty to tell the President how to run the university. A voice only slightly less forceful than the students who tell the President how to run the university. It is my enormous pleasure, and I do so with immense gratitude for the tasks they have undertaken, to invite Don and Elaine to introduce the beginnings of our institute and tonight's honored guest, Dr. Scott Appleby.
We're going to do something a little unusual tonight and give a two-layered introduction, partly because it is the first major event of our institution, the Boniok Institute. I want to give a little introduction to the Kroc Institute, from which Professor Appleby comes, and then Elaine will introduce the speaker. No institute or center in the world, so far as we've been able to determine, and I've Googled in multiple languages, duplicates exactly the Boniok Institute's mission. But a number of centers have missions that overlap with ours. One of the Institute's goals this year is to reach out and build relationships with other major related institutions. When we thought about putting together a program for the year, the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies was the first on my list, and we're delighted that Professor Appleby is here. The Kroc Institute is one of the world's leading centers for peace studies. They offer an undergraduate major and a minor in peace studies. They offer a master's degree. The master's students are required to spend part of their time earning the degree during field work at sites across the world. The Kroc Institute recently introduced a PhD program in peace studies in 5 interdisciplinary fields. Now, notice the word I'm about to stress in the Boniok Institute's name. The Boniok Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance. The Boniok Institute aims to change the world, not just to study it. The Kroc Institute can serve as a model and inspiration for us in several ways. First, over the last 2,500 years, I'm a classicist. Oh, those are the time periods I think in. But over the last 25 years, they have produced over 1,200 alumni who are applying what they've learned in their personal lives and often professionally as well. Indeed, the master's program aims to produce practitioners. It, in their words, attracts students from around the world who are committed to lifelong careers in public policy, political change, management of organizations in peace and justice, and conflict transformation. As we have the donors whose gift establishes the Boniok Institute here with us tonight, I'd like to say a little about the philanthropic vision behind the Kroc Institute. In April 1985, Mrs. Kroc was in the audience when Reverend Hesburgh, the president emeritus at the time of Notre Dame, gave a lecture in San Diego, California. He urged scientists and religious leaders to work together to halt the nuclear arms race and emphasized the role of universities in training a new generation of leaders. Impressed by his approach, she offered to help. By the end of that calendar year, Mrs. Kroc made a $6 million gift to establish an institute at Notre Dame that would be a center for multidisciplinary research and teaching on critically important questions of peace, justice, violence. Mrs. Kroc in 2003 left a very substantial bequest, which enabled the Kroc Institute to become the major institution it now is. In a similar way, the Bonioks first gave a generous gift to establish the Boniok Center, and this year they have added a magnificent gift to establish the Boniok Institute. In 2011, the Kroc Institute observed its 25th anniversary, celebrating Mrs. Kroc's legacy and the work of faculty, students, and the many alumni building peace around the world. I look forward to a similar anniversary 25 years from now, celebrating the Boniok Institute's many valuable accomplishments in the study and advancement of religious tolerance.
Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to see all of you here, and in agreement with Don and President Liebran, this is a momentous occasion. I want to thank the staff of the Boniok Institute, particularly B.J. Smith, who've worked tirelessly to put on the series of events surrounding this one. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening Professor Scott Appleby. to present some of his work on the roots of religious violence and the potential of religious peace building. His title is the John M. Reagan Jr. Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and Professor of History at University of Notre Dame. The title is certainly impressive, but I don't think it does real justice to the way that Appleby has used his research to bring significant change. 30 years ago at the University of Chicago, Appleby began to work closely with the famous religious studies scholar Martin Marty to pioneer and promote the rigorous comparative study of fundamentalism around the globe. From 1998 to 1993, Appleby was co-director of the Fundamentalism Project, which is an international public policy study of conservative religious movements throughout the world, conducted by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Through this project, colleagues say that Appleby revitalized the social, scientific, and multidisciplinary study of religion, and the result was a new way of understanding and promoting the rigorous comparative study of fundamentalism around the globe. They saw then already what would become a very serious global problem literally decades before 9/11. A colleague from graduate school put it aptly when he said about Appleby's work, "This is humanist scholarship at its most prescient," I think. He's been a fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies since 1996 and director since 2000. He teaches courses in American religious history and comparative religious movements at the University of Notre Dame. And from 1990, he has also released the influential report, Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a New Imperative for U.S. Foreign Policy. He also directs most recently Contending Modernities, a major multi-year project to examine the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and secular forces in the modern world. Appleby is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of 3 honorary doctorates from Fordham University, Scranton University, and St. John's University, Collegeville, Minnesota. Where is the place for research in stopping religious violence, which is such a pressing, important issue where we think we ought to simply take action quickly? There's certainly passionate debate by scholars and especially community leaders and people in the pews themselves who simply want to do something to stop something that appears to be such an egregious breach of humanitarian ideals. In the midst of the call and the need for radical action, there seems to be a need also to wait and reflect on what might be the best way forward. And that's why I think it's particularly important to have an institute as phenomenal as the Banyuk Institute happening at a place like Rice University. I want to share with you just briefly a parable that a religious leader brought to my attention that's attributed, as I did some Google work myself, to several different religious sources, and it goes like this. One summer in the village, the people in the town gathered for a picnic. As they leisurely shared food and conversation, someone noticed a baby in the river struggling and crying. The baby was going to drown. Someone rushed to save the baby. Then they noticed another screaming baby in the river, and they pulled that baby out. Soon more babies were seen drowning in the river, and the townspeople were pulling them out as fast as they could. It took great effort, and they began to organize their activities in order to save the babies as they came down the river. As everyone else was busy with these rescue efforts to save the babies and building orphanages and schools and all kinds of things, 2 of the townspeople simply started to run away from the shore of the river. "Where are you going?" shouted one of the rescuers. "We need you here to help us save these babies." "We are not going to be part of these efforts anymore," they said. "We are going to go upstream and we are going to figure out who is throwing those babies in." In its worst form, the Academy, I think, is often rightly criticized as being in an ivory tower with no central importance to help solve societal problems. But in its best form, and I think we're seeing a piece of that here tonight, universities can provide society significant space to stop and reflect, to listen to scholars, and for scholars to listen to practitioners and community members in very intentional and significant ways, to understand how research can inform greater effectiveness of efforts. Appleby's work and that of the Kroc Institute provides that kind of space, and we hope to model that here to help us understand the conditions when religion leads to peace and the conditions when it leads to violence. He's going to share with us about that work now. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. Let me thank President Lebrun, Professor Eklund, Professor Morrison, and of course, Mr. and Mrs. Banyuk for establishing this institute for the study and advancement of religious tolerance. We were talking at dinner. There's really nothing like it that I know of in the country or even in the world. The Kroc Institute, as Elaine mentioned and Don mentioned, is a peace studies institute that's broad-ranging, and we do have a focus on religion, conflict, peace building, and there are other centers around the country that focus on this, but none of them has the generous endowment that this institute now has, and none of them is solely focused on this crucial question of religious tolerance. So Rice is really setting the trend here and responding in a way that's very encouraging to those of us who think this is one of the most important problems in the world. So thank you again for your vision and your support of this important endeavor. My topic tonight is religion and violent conflict beyond tolerance toward peace building. Tolerance, presumably, is a civic and social good. Who would quarrel with anybody advocating greater tolerance, especially among and within religions? And understandably, calls for tolerance are widespread, at least among progressive, ecumenical, liberal-minded folk. And yet I have noticed that advocates of tolerance seldom define the term. What precisely is tolerance? What does it mean to be tolerant? So I looked at the Banyuk website to find the definition. I got some help. The Institute is dedicated, we are told, to nurturing tolerance among people of all and no faiths, especially youth, and to studying the conditions in which tolerance and intolerance flourish. Great. Elsewhere, we have another clue in the stated aspiration, quote, to promote conditions conducive to sustainable peace among persons of different religions. And there's mention of the goal of peaceful coexistence, which is linked to the term tolerance. On another link in the website, there is mention of, quote, religious literacy, mutual understanding, and interfaith collaboration between members of different faith traditions and spiritual or secular communities, close quotes. The Banyuk Institute seeks to leverage learning and constructive dialogue into positive social action, particularly engaging people for whom pluralism is a problem. I like that formulation because there are a lot of people for whom pluralism is a problem, and it's easy to talk to the people who think it's just a great thing. So the challenge is to talk to people who are uncomfortable with diversity, pluralism, people of many faiths, of no faith, coexisting peacefully. Finally, in my quest for a definition, I went to the link to the Building Bridges essay by the winner of the 2012-2013 essay competition, Safia Barwani, then a junior, now I presume a senior, at Stephen F. Austin High School. Her essay is thoughtful and compelling, but it stays away from any direct definition of tolerance. The essay opens with citations from Milan Kundera and Henry David Thoreau that claim that understanding another person with deep empathy or co-feeling, as she puts it, with that person is the very purpose of human life. She writes, I believe that tolerance is the start of a journey to achieving both of these ideals. Then she goes on to discuss very sensitively, in a nuanced way, the many benefits of cultivating tolerance, the exact meaning of which remains elusive. Now, I'm picking on my host in a way, but in good spirit because we're not alone here in dodging the definition of tolerance. Many of the scholars who write on this struggle with what exactly do we mean by tolerance. So I'd like to address the first set of my remarks to that question. What do we mean by tolerance? The Oxford English Dictionary is useful in a pinch like this, and that venerable tome offers 5 categories of the definition of the word tolerance, with A, B, and C, and D subsets in each category, adding up to 20 or so permutations. Don't worry, I'm not going through all of them. The most relevant to our purposes are these 3 categories. Tolerance is, number 1, the act or practice of enduring or sustaining pain or hardship. as if I can tolerate this pain. So that's the very first definition. Can I sustain this hardship? Second, the action of allowing, as in to give license, permission granted by an authority, that is, I will tolerate that practice of yours by my authority. The third definition, the action or practice of tolerating, toleration, the disposition to be patient with or indulgent to the opinions or practices of others, freedom from bigotry or undue severity in judging the conduct of others, forbearance, catholicity of spirit. I like that phrase, catholicity, small c, of spirit, forbearance. This third categorical definition of tolerance seems to be what is often meant by the use of the word, as in Mrs. Barwani's essay. I would suggest that this, however, is an expression of what we might call a soft tolerance. This weak and wishy-washy version of tolerance, writes my mentor Martin Marty in a book that I recommend to you, one of his 50-something books. This one is particularly relevant to this topic. It's entitled When Faiths Collide. When Faiths Collide. Marty says this weak and wishy-washy version of tolerance seems to be, quote, the faith of those who believe little and lightly and ask you to do the same so you can meet with each other at low risk, or so say the critics. So those who believe little and lightly ask you to do the same so you can meet with one another at low risk. The social contract underlying this soft form of tolerance seems to be this. You believe what you believe. I respect your right to believe and practice as you choose, as long as you respect mine. This is kind of a form of utilitarianism. That is, you can be free as long as your exercise of freedom doesn't get in the way of my exercise of freedom. Let bygones be bygones, live and let live. Look the other way if you must at the things about me with which you disagree or do not like. It's a form of soft tolerance. In criticizing soft tolerance in this way, or beginning to, I do not mean to dismiss it or to belie its usefulness. To the contrary, in so many settings of religious and ethnic violence, which are marked often by a virtually pathological intolerance of the other, the achievement of any form of tolerance and forbearance would and should be considered a great victory. However, and this is the argument of my presentation this evening, soft tolerance is inadequate to the task of, quote, promoting conditions conducive to sustainable peace among persons of different religions, as the website has it. It's inadequate, soft tolerance, to doing that task, to accomplishing that task. Among other things, soft tolerance falls short of requiring or even promoting, quote, religious literacy, mutual understanding, and interfaith collaboration between members of different faith traditions and spiritual or secular communities. It's not going to do that. Indeed, soft tolerance can be seen as a form of condescension toward the other. Some Jewish scholars in particular, not Jewish scholars alone, but some of them in particular, are wary about this, about tolerance, which they equate with what I'm calling soft tolerance. They see it as a virtue too weak to be of help in improving relations among faith communities or to help their group retain boundaries and loyalty. The late Jewish biblical scholar Jacob Neusner summarizes this point of view. Quote, tolerance does not suffice. A theory of the other that concedes that the outsider is right for the other but not for me involves a meretricious relativism that religious believers cannot really mean. Religions will have to learn to think about each other not merely to tolerate the other as an unavoidable inconvenience or an evil that cannot be eliminated. They face the task of thinking within their own theological framework and religious system about the place within that structure of the other outside of it. Marty himself quotes Stephen R. Barton approvingly, who speaks of a, quote, proper tolerance and a proper intolerance that cannot be fit within the frame of post-Enlightenment secular individualism. The truth claims of world religions, Marty concludes, by their very distinctiveness and particularity, have made significant contribution to a right understanding of tolerance and the possibility and practice of different peoples living together in harmony, but a harmony based upon faith in and faithfulness to their God, close quote. Marty, Neusner, and others, including several Muslim thinkers, are endorsing what we might call a hard tolerance. That is, a position that accords the other a minimum respect, the benefit of the doubt, a notion that the difference between them is principled, well-reasoned, profound, not trivial, born of long-standing, careful consideration of their respective communities, respective myths, symbols, ethical virtues, worldviews, and the like. This is a hard tolerance, to assume that the other person has made his or her decisions, taken these beliefs and practices out of careful consideration and are willing to defend them. I tolerate you in the sense of enduring the pain of our difference on the chance that we might now engage in reasoned debate and conversation. I grant you your humanity in its reasons and passions and spiritual depths, and therefore I care deeply about what you believe, and I want to explore and critique it with you. This is hard tolerance, the willingness to actually engage the other. But let me hasten to qualify our enthusiasm for hard tolerance, because the all-important question of motivation, a difficult to discern question at best, makes all the difference in determining the conditions under which hard tolerance is actually an aid to religious peace building. Among the religious, especially, there may be many motives for hard tolerance or for engaging the other. Number one, my goal is to convert you, to save your soul, to liberate you from your damnable state of apostasy or heresy. Accordingly, let's talk. Let me hear all about your convictions and beliefs and readings of sacred scriptures so that I can set you straight eventually. Once it becomes clear that you consider this a conversation among equals and then remain committed to this position, my hard tolerance strategy will be replaced with stronger stuff. This response is typical of some very zealous missionary types and also of fundamentalists, complicated word I can talk about in the discussion session if you'd like. The two groups overlap but are not to be conflated, that is, zealous missionaries and fundamentalist religious figures. What they share was identified in the project that I worked on, the Fundamentalism Project, as a tendency toward absolutism, that is, toward the belief that my truth is absolute. This is actually, speaking from a Christian, a heresy. This is not a position I often discuss with every other Christian believer, but the Christian doctrine of God traditionally is that God is unknowable as God, and that everything that we say about God is analogical. We have a Thomist scholar in the room, at least one, is analogical, and that our words and our doctrines and our dogmas are always qualified. And yet, there is a tendency, not just within fundamentalism religion, within any religious tradition, to think our formulation, our insights are absolutely correct. They are not to be relativized, they are not to be conditioned, and they're certainly superior to yours in terms of the truth claims. Now, this is a complicated question, but this notion of an understanding that our religious convictions are unsurpassable in their accuracy when speaking about things of the divine, the sacred, is at the root of a certain kind of hard tolerance. Here's a second approach of the religious that might be called hard tolerance. Tell me about your beliefs and convictions, your practices and rituals and ethical systems. I respect you indeed. In fact, my goal is to win your love and approval at any cost. Doctrines and other differences in worldviews or values should never stand between two human beings or two communities. In fact, I'm ready to concede whatever needs to be conceded to establish our common humanity as the bridge between us. This form of hard tolerance is, of course, just another variety of soft tolerance masquerading as hard tolerance. Its roots in tradition, history, community, argument, the stuff of a sustainable religious culture tend to be very shallow. It is the practice of ultra-liberals, secular humanists, some Unitarians, Universalists, various branches in various religious traditions that have decided that firm conviction, firm belief, doctrine, dogma, ritual really are the problem. Let's jettison them in the service of our common humanity. This form of tolerance can build peace, but only among like-minded, gentle, kind souls. Unfortunately, peace must be built between enemies. Here's a third version of hard tolerance. Let's hope this one's better. It's my last one. I respect you. Let's walk a bit down this potholed road together. Share a meal and perhaps a battle or two. Get to know one another with deeds and perhaps also with words. And then we'll see if I respect your ways of life and the beliefs and convictions that stand behind it. I will be hard-headed in my explanation and defense of my own beliefs, convictions, and so on, and will be rigorously demanding of you to give reasons for your own. But I promise you one thing, sister, if we can build trust among ourselves over time, at some point, I will take the risk of hospitality. That is, welcoming you as a guest into my abode, literally and metaphorically. I will be open, however begrudgingly, to not only the risk of hospitality, but the risk of transformation. I certainly don't expect, nor should you, that this openness will lead to some kind of conversion to your tradition or way of life, though I suppose that is the meaning ultimately of risk. Instead, I realize that I might be changed by the encounter with you. I might undergo some kind of transformation in subtle or not so subtle ways by this honest and full engagement with you and your history and your own religious imagination, your reasons for being you. But let's take it slowly. It's probably not good to tweet about this. So here we approach timidly and tentatively the possibility of a hard tolerance that might morph into the kind of long-term constructive relationship that stands as the sine qua non of social peace building. So a few words about peace building based on this advocacy of this kind of hard tolerance. What is peace building? Again, the word can admit of many definitions. The way we think of it at the Kroc Institute, and we're interested primarily in violent conflict. We see conflict itself as not a bad thing. It's inevitable. Conflict is an opportunity for constructive change. So the question is not about conflict or trying to do away with conflict, but rather trying to channel conflict into constructive paths, not destructive or violent ones. And the approach that peace building takes is as follows. Peace building is precisely the mode of transforming conflict that strives, first of all, to cover the longue durée of a conflict, the long history of it. Conflict resolution is the practice of solving the immediate problem, and this is very important. It's the getting to yes approach. How can we stop the fighting, the shooting? How can we resolve our immediate differences? Stop the bloodletting. Let's resolve the issue, the presenting issues. Let's treat the symptoms. The problem with relying solely on conflict resolution is that you've treated the symptoms, but the disease doesn't go away. The disease is deeply rooted, long-term, historically conditioned, especially when you're talking about conflicts between religions, which can draw upon whether or not their own histories of that community, but they can draw upon millennia in some cases, certainly decades or centuries of grievances one against the other. Imagine the situation, we can take many conflicts, Israel-Palestine. We're hoping for a soft tolerance there. If you've been killing my family, my grandfather, my child, my loved ones, not just recently, but over the last decades, and I've been killing yours, we're not going to get to yes anytime soon, and we're certainly not even going to approach yes until we begin to go deeper and to find the roots of that conflict and begin to address them, and this is going to take time. And it's going to take a certain kind of tolerance that has to be cultivated and a certain kind of looking away many times in order to keep the conversation going. So peace building is long-term, and this is why it can be very frustrating to policy people who want the solution in 6 weeks or in 6 months at best, and you say, well, we're going to make progress, but what are the metrics? Everyone wants to know, funders want to know, donors want to know, what are the metrics? Not only of scholarship, but peace building is even worse in terms of how long does it take to gestate and to build seeds. So one of the challenges of peace building is, can we find some markers to indicate we're not just wasting our time? One of the challenges here is proving a negative. When I studied Northern Ireland's conflict, the Troubles over 3 decades, there were 3,700 deaths during those 3 decades. And Northern Ireland is one of the examples in the world, what I call the saturation mode of peace building. That is, for 30 years, the churches, civil society, the government, every layer of society had activities for peace building. And so the cynic would say, so you did all this peace building, you brought Catholic and Protestant children to Corrymeela, which is a camp for teenagers who get to know one another across these divisions, and you did all these things, and there were still 3,700 deaths. The peace builders' response immediately is, if we hadn't done this, there would have been 37,000 deaths, and there would never be a Good Friday agreement. Now, how do you prove that? That's proving a negative. When I was in Belfast studying this, really my first time in Belfast, my first trip, it's hard to tell the Catholics and Protestants apart initially because they're all Irish, and to an outsider, they all look alike and sound alike until you begin to pick up the cues. The Protestants say Northern Ireland, the Catholics say north of Ireland, and so on. And so I began to get the hang of it, and of course they live in these enclaves that are chillingly mirror images of one another. You go down Falls Road, if you've ever been to Belfast. Falls Road is the Catholic enclave. Everything's green for Ireland. Catholic heroes, Bobby Sands murals. It's like a bunker, an enclave. You go down just a little walk on this direction, and you're in the Ulster, that is the Protestant neighborhood, Shankill Road. Everything's orange, not green, for the Ulster Orangemen. And there are murals on the wall of their heroes. It's pretty chillingly reverse system. So when I was going back to the airport after my first visit, the cabbie picked me up. I sat in the front seat with him, and I was so pleased with myself, I could tell he was a Protestant. And I said, well, and he was about 40. I said, did you ever join one of the paramilitaries? You're from, where? I said, where are you from? He said, Shankill Road. I said, well, did you ever join one of the paramilitaries? He said, no, I never joined one of the paramilitaries. My brother did. He's still in it. It's hard to get out. All they do is run drugs and guns. It's not very idealistic. Why didn't you join? Because I can't do the brogue, but because when I was 14 years old, my mother made me go to a place called Corrymeela. And I'd never seen any Catholics before, really. We were taught to kind of hate them, but I had to spend 3 weeks with these Catholics, and I realized they were very similar to me in every way. So the logic of killing them didn't make sense to me, so I didn't join the paramilitary. I'm hugging the man at this point. He said, get back on your seat. You're my negative proof. But you can't that metric is hard to make empirical, but I believe it's true. So peace building is partly prevention. It's partly trying to build these constructive relationships based on a hard tolerance and forge solutions commensurate to the deep historical roots of the inhumane personal, social, and political relationships that have fueled conflict and deadly violence. Peace builders enter into and try to facilitate hard, tolerant relationships with as many actors in a conflict setting as possible, for they strive to address all phases of these protracted conflicts within which pre-violence, violence, and post-violence periods are difficult to differentiate, because conflict occurs in a cycle. At the heart of peace building, in short, is relatio, that is, relationships. In order to succeed in this practice, peace builders must build sustainable human relationships at every level of society, between local ethnic and religious groups, between political parties and governments, between faith-based groups and non-governmental organizations, between local and international offices or agencies dedicated to conflict transformation, and so on. Such relationships cannot be built after the shooting has stopped and the latest peace talks are underway, but only in between and during systematic and recurrent episodes of violence. Moreover, the various peace-building tools, various kinds of educational tools, conflict prevention tools, resolution, advocacy, are deployed by people living in the local communities who are engaged in the conflict. Outsiders can come and train people and help them, but they have to really be conducted by the local community, those who are most directly victimized by violence. They must be conducted by national elites in the churches, the government, the business, and other sectors, and by diplomats, policymakers, scholars, international lawyers, religious leaders, and other professionals operating at a geographical remove from the grassroots. At dinner tonight, the point was made that religious studies in itself is not sufficient for religious peace building, and that's true. People with expertise in understanding religious and religious dynamics are essential, of course, to building religious tolerance of this kind. But religion is often, or seldom rather, if ever, unfolds in a vacuum. There are social and economic and psychological, material conditions that are intertwined with religion in various ways we could talk about if you'd like, so that peace building is multidisciplinary. It has to bring together different areas of expertise working in tandem. What does it mean to enter into this hard, tolerant conversation among religious people? Another former mentor of mine at the University of Chicago, now retired, David Tracy, tries to make this notion of hard tolerance appealing to people with a very modern or even a kind of postmodern mentality by elaborating his notion of conversation. What is a conversation that includes or it's based on hard tolerance? Tracy believes that pluralism is not just something that happens to occur in our modern world. It occurs in our modern world because it's structured within human language itself. It's constituent of human history. It's not going to go away. It's very much woven into our DNA. And it can often interrupt our capacity for conversation. Yet, we can have relatively adequate knowledge of one another, he says, better interpretations, verified possibilities, and judicious discourse. We first have to give up of dreams of Western domination, mastery, these are certainly over, or the domination of one tradition over another. Conversation has to occur across language and time and differences with the internal other. There must be responsibility on the part of all. Quote, responsibility means capable of responding. We must be capable of facing the interruptions in our history, of discarding any scenarios of innocent triumph by our side, which are always written by the victors. We must be capable of not forgetting the subversive memories of individuals and whole peoples whose names we do not even know. If we attempt such responses, we are making a beginning, and only a modest beginning, in assuming historical responsibility. So we have to drop the pretensions to dominance, to absolutism, and we have to drop ignoring the subaltern or marginalized voices that have to be heard, because there's the phenomena in violence and conflict of spoilers. Spoilers are those who don't get a seat at the table, and the way they respond to that lack of a seat at the table is they set off a bomb as the peace accord is being signed and every other day thereafter. This makes peace accords hard to sustain. David Tracy understands such responsible conversation as the bulwark against both despairing skepticism and triumphant retrieval of the tradition. Let me conclude my remarks now so we can talk a bit by just a few words on how religion complicates this matter further. Religious extremists, we again can talk more about the dynamics of religious extremists. There are many sources and motivations for religious extremism. That is, for religious actors who may sincerely believe that it is their duty, their sacred obligation, to defend their tradition with violence, with deadly violence. But this is a debilitating remedy for the religious, and often they eventually, certainly their communities in which the religious extremists live, come to recognize what a debilitating approach it is to the fact of being excluded, or to settling a grievance, or simply to the will to power. This kind of violence saps the moral strength of the community, undermines their reason for being. In the final analysis, violence is insufficient to the cause of the religious. To be effective advocates of social justice and religious renewal, religious militants must find vehicles of persuasion, not coercion. Religious militants themselves provide authoritative testimony regarding the moral dangers and the political inadequacy of violent intolerance. There are those leaders, religious leaders, who have a zeal for their faith, and they practice what we would call nonviolent tolerance. Militants of this kind reject the use of deadly violence, identify enemies according to their deeds rather than their ethnicity or religion, and seek reconciliation with those enemies. Tolerant, nonviolent militants for faith include religious virtuosi, holy monks and gurus, learned rabbis and mullahs, dedicated priests and imams, devout laity who place themselves in harm's way by working in conflict zones among the poor and the dispossessed. They have recently, in the last couple decades, begun to make themselves available to be trained as conflict mediators, and they take responsibility for rebuilding the institutions of war-ravaged societies, because in so many conflict settings, it is the religious leaders and the religious communities who are locally rooted, who weather the storm, who are most trusted, who have social capital. And so when religious leaders eschew violence as the response and are tolerant in a nonviolent way, they often are key catalysts in mediating conflict and rebuilding societies. Not all of these leaders are charismatic, high-profile people. To the contrary, if you study the historical record, most of them are rank-and-file members of the religious community. Some work as professionals in governmental and non-government organizations. Paradoxically, this form of hard tolerance may emerge in religious communities by introducing small elements of ambiguity into the mix, into their lives. Or that is, to having leaders point to the ambiguity, the lack of clarity, the lack of definitive truth, the open-endedness of the conversation. If you raise the tolerance for ambiguity in a system of total certainty, you raise the potential for the emergence of new and different interpretations. This is one of the keys to breaking reactive cycles of violence. This poses a very significant challenge to religious peace builders. The tendency in religious conflicts is to mix up as one phenomenon the certainty of belief with the certainty of the evil intention of the enemy that wants to destroy your belief. So confidence in one's own point of view gets translated into the evil of the one who's also confident on the other side of the line. The conciliator has to find a way to befriend both sides, recognize the necessity of respecting and even helping people hold to their most profound fundamental beliefs, while at the same time finding ways to create an ambiguity which is an opening as to the threat and ill intent attributed to a range of enemies. The idea here is a recognition. One can't recognize very readily the other as an interlocutor, as someone to engage in constructive collaboration or dialogue, if the other is perceived as dogmatic, fanatical, extreme, and that begins to break down when you recognize those tendencies in yourself and you admit of human frailty. So many of the stories of effective religious peace building and tolerance comes with an element of brokenness. Paul Tillich talks about the broken myth, the brokenness that is the recognition our own symbols, our own rituals, they're still precious to us, but they're broken in the sense of broken open, like a heart that is broken but then is also open to new possibilities. A recognition that our faith is sacred to us, but not absolute, not the final word on human existence. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I've talked about hard tolerance as opposed to soft, about the need for conversation, and about some of the, just skim the surface, of some of the particular challenges regarding religious peace building. There's much more to say, but it's time for me to pause and let you do a lot of the talking. Thanks for your attention.
I also want to leave a few minutes for you all to ask questions of Professor Appleby. So as I'm asking my questions on behalf of the students, then you think up questions to ask him as well, okay? I have a sort of dangerous question to ask a scholar who's written volumes and spent many years studying fundamentalism, but could you give me a brief definition of fundamentalism? And then, it's always very dangerous.
I can certainly give you a definition. I don't know about brief, but go ahead.
Yeah, and is fundamentalism always bad when it comes to peacekeeping efforts related to religion?
Very quickly, fundamentalists are modern people. They're not the Amish. They are looking forward. They're, in that sense, progressive. They want to build an alternative to secular, what they consider godless ways of organizing society. When we studied fundamentalism across the world in 6 or 7 different religious traditions, that is, religious resurgence of this type, what profession did they come from the most? Do you think? Engineers, thank you. Engineers, number 1. I know Rice is filled with fundamentalists as a result. There are also computer software folks. That is, these are people, not all of them, but the rank and file and the early leadership of them, of these groups, these various groups, are actually people quite comfortable with the instrumental aspects of scientific modernity. They know that they can fire Stinger missiles or take down American Airlines planes was not a big surprise to those of us studying. That doesn't mean they're astrophysicists. They're not philosophers. They're not comfortable with speculative thought. They read their scriptures and traditions, which are, in fact, ambiguous, multivocal. The Bible, for example. Try to make the Bible, whether the Torah, the New Testament, whichever text you want, into a blueprint for social action. The only way to do that is to do what Jefferson did, cut and paste and throw things out that you don't like. So fundamentalists approach their scriptures and traditions like an engineer or an architect might approach a toolbox. I don't need this right now or that right now, this is what I need. So they selectively retrieve elements of the tradition and therefore do a kind of violence to the tradition if you're really a traditional person, because a traditional religious person lives with the ambiguity. In one part of Luke's gospel, Jesus says, if they're not with us, they're against us. A couple verses later, if they're not against us, they're with us. Well, Lord, which is it? Would you make up your mind? Maybe those things can be reconciled, but there are many voices and interpretive strands, and one struggles with the tradition. fundamentalists don't have time for the struggle. They are building something. They are retrieving parts of their tradition, but they're very modern. They are also absolutist, as I mentioned. I won't mention that. They tend to be Manichaean or dualist. They believe they're reactive against what they consider to be encroachments that are not accidental or merely contingent. That is, the modern world is out to destroy religious faith, out to destroy religious belief. Whatever you think about President Obama, if you listen to some of Christian evangelical and Catholic colleagues of mine, they don't think he's just a president who's following liberal policies. Some of them think this is all part of a conspiracy that is liberal and secular and godless and is part of a historical trajectory against God, Bible-believing, God-fearing, etc. Islam has its own version of this as well. So does Judaism. They're reacting against what they consider to be assault upon their traditional ways of life and their faith, and they do so by selecting from the tradition, from modernity, and then making sharp distinctions between the good and the evil, the elect and the reprobate, the chosen and the damned. And the final piece of it ideologically, this is as brief as I can do it, is, interestingly, they tend to be apocalyptic, more so than, so for example, Muslims, Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, the two major versions of Islam, or strands within Islam. Shia Islam has a pretty heavy element of apocalypticism, millennialism, that is, a sense that the final days are coming, and when those final days are coming, everything will be reversed, and the righteous will finally get their vengeance. The Shia notion is the hidden imam will return. When Khomeini became president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, many of his devout followers called him the imam, meaning the hidden imam returned. He never corrected them, but he never claimed to be the hidden imam. He is more like the John the Baptist of the hidden imam, maybe. But the point was, he was going to come and reverse many, many decades and centuries of Shia suffering under Sunni dominance and under secular dominance. That's very pronounced in Shiism. What's interesting is that Sunni Islam, the majority strain in Islam, during the last 50 years has also retrieved its Mahdi tradition and its notion of the Dajjal or the Antichrist type. These traditions want to proclaim we're at the end time, we're at a moment in history that's pivotal. This is not ordinary time in history. One of the ways that functions socially is these traditions are recruiting people, young people, to do violence, to be suicide bombers, to join a holy war, whatever the tradition might be. And they have to justify what is clearly a departure from the mainstream teaching of their holy texts. And the way they do that is by saying, and in fact, in every sacred scripture, you have what I call an emergency clause, right? Love your enemy, forgive, so on. And there's usually a verse, the Sikh scriptures, the Granth Sahib, the living guru. If you read the Sikh scriptures, they're constantly talking about love and peace and forgiveness and forbearance and tolerance and so forth. There is one line that says, however, if the Sikh tradition is under mortal threat, you are required to take up the sword. So the fundamentalists say it's under mortal threat, this is the end time, normally we wouldn't be talking about bombing innocent people or whatever, now we do. So those things, reactive to the modern, selective of the tradition, absolutist, dualist, and kind of apocalyptic or millennial, that's a kind of ideological logic that is shared, interestingly, by religious groups that don't agree with one another on anything else. And this is a mode of reacting to what they consider to be, not without justification, consider to be a threatening. So is there anything good about fundamentalism? Well, if you want to understand what the pressure points and the weaknesses of a society are, you study the fundamentalists. If you understand, and often, in a neutral way, that because they're very good at critique, very good at defending certain kinds of values you may or may not embrace, but if you do, they're quite accomplished in analyzing the situation. They fail, often miserably, when they try to address the situation in their own way. It often exacerbates some of the problems. I'll be shorter. That was a big question.
Yeah, I know. These Rice students. Another question we have is, a lot of your examples have dealt with religious conflict internationally, and that makes sense given the kind of work that you do and the focus of the Kroc Institute. Why do we need religious tolerance in the United States?
Oh, well, there's so many reasons. It's really a struggle of where to begin. I mean, we could begin on the Islamic Prayer Center near the site of 9/11 and the controversy that occurred a few years ago about that, and the way in which Muslim Americans are demonized. As a Catholic, the parallels to 19th century Catholicism and to the early migration of Jews to this country, to WASP America in the 19th century, are striking, in that Catholics were also accused of not being able to be democratic. They followed a foreign pontiff, of actually being less than fully American, and in some cases, less than virtuous humans. And there's a long tradition of nativism and anti-Catholicism. We could go into a long history, of course, of anti-Semitism and of prejudice against the Jewish communities. Around the world, this is a major problem, and the United States is not free of it. So many, if not all, of the conflicts around the world about religious intolerance have their own root or their own manifestations here. One of the reassuring aspects, and it's qualified reassurance, is that we have the rule of law here, and we have toleration built into our Constitution, to our legal system, at least in principle, to be accessed. And so Catholics took, this is the first Supreme Court, right, without a Protestant on it. There are 5 Catholics, God help us, and there are 4 Jewish scholars on it. So it worked in that. I mean, that's one metaphor for the fact that these minority religions, if you will, over the course of time, were able to take advantage of openings in education and civil liberties and rights shrewdly. It took time. It took a lot of time in order to enter not only the middle class, but the upper middle class. American Jews and Roman Catholics in the late 20th century were the 2 most prosperous former minorities in the country.
I want to give you some time to answer a few questions, and then we have a reception after as well that we want to make sure you get to. So just a little bit of training with the questions. We have some mics. If you could make your way to a microphone. I always say that questions end with a sort of raise in your voice at the end. What do you think about this?
My question is about the David Tracy concepts that you mentioned, especially this idea about the conversation. One is, where does he propound this, in which of his works, and where I might be able to sort of read a little more about it. But in the other sense is that a conversation by its nature involves more than one person. But does Tracy extend that to more than 2 for this kind of thinking?
Yes, I can answer those fairly quickly. The name of the book was not developed by a marketer. It's called Pluralism and Ambiguity, Religion, Hermeneutics, Hope. So pluralism and ambiguity. It's not going to fly off the bestseller list, but it's a short book and very rich in these concepts. And David Tracy himself is, yes, multiple conversations going on at once with a lot of interlocutors. So it's not, certainly he would, as a student in his class many, many years ago, David Tracy is so brilliant. When he's lecturing, he has conversations with himself that you have to listen in on. I mean, literally, he starts getting distracted and talks to himself, and it's a very interesting conversation because he's channeling Aquinas or Averroes or whoever. But he very much wants to draw into as many partners as will play by the rules.
Yes, Dr. Appleby, I wonder, you touched on this a bit when you referred to religious fundamentalism as being modern. I wonder if you could expand a bit on how religious fundamentalism fits into the historical context of religion and the evolution of religious belief. And my other question, too, is, if I may, is you referred to fundamentalism, you use the analogy of pulling tools out of the toolbox, but that seems to be kind of different than one of the characterizations I've typically heard of fundamentalism, which is that even as deplorable as the actions of fundamentalists and their views may be, at least they are the ones who make the attempt to take their beliefs seriously, the religious texts seriously enough that they make the attempt to believe in all of it, as opposed to just picking and choosing the parts that are palatable.
Okay. On the second question, let me make a correction on this front. I'm not talking about anyone as a fundamentalist. Let me talk about fundamentalism as a mode of religious discourse and activity. The reason that distinction is important is I think many people in traditional religious communities move in and out of this mode, this logic I was describing. So I don't want to get into a name or blame game. So-and-so is a fundamental. That's a useless exercise. There is, I think, something to the logic I described that is very appealing. What's appealing about it is related to, one of the things appealing about it is related to your first question about the modernity of fundamentalism and its genealogy, which I won't go into in great detail, only to say that time is one way to understand fundamentalists. They are impatient. That is, because of this sense that there's a juggernaut historically threatening them and threatening what they believe, threatening their sincere devotion to what, as you described it, the religious tradition and its integrity, the anxiety, which is often a word used, the sense of exile, which is particularly used in Jewish context, fundamentalist, the sense of anxiety, we have to act now. That sense of urgency and anxiety in this mode of defensiveness actually, ironically, in my judgment, compels many of these true believers to play fast and loose with the tradition. When I was saying before that someone who's committed to the religious tradition is committed to a messy, ambiguous, life-giving, vital, rich whole. When I say I use the toolkit and the engineering mentality, it's not to, engineers have to get things done. Thank goodness for that. They want to build something now. They're not going to wait for a decade. And the fundamentalist mentality is partly time is against us, time is running out. This is why I mentioned the kind of apocalyptic notion. We are empowered to act now. What that leads them to do is to be very selective, to take this and that, which has to be embedded in its context to make it really traditional. So they're not traditionalists, they're not conservative, and they're not orthodox. Okay? They're fundamentalists. There's a difference. Sometimes, it's hard to perceive it, but it's there, and it's in the rapidity of the manipulation of the tradition. Everyone across the board, liberal, conservative, orthodox, manipulates the tradition, don't get me wrong. The fundamentalists do it guided by the signs of the times and a political project that they feel is urgent.
If a faith wishes to pursue hard tolerance in the third method you outlined, using persuasion, is the onus on them to create an elite that is very well versed in the faith, or to arm every one of its members with factoids and arguments?
That's a terrific question. It really is. If you, just to repeat the question, amplify it, it's very important. This hard tolerance, which is a tolerance that says, here's why I believe what I believe. Let me explain it to you, because I want you to understand me and I want to hear from you. I'm going to be skeptical, but I want to hear. It doesn't mean, so the question is, does that mean only elites can play? That is, only people who can quote Irenaeus or Maimonides or Aquinas, or who know their tradition backwards and forwards? In some ways, you would think the answer is yes. I don't think so. I think this is part of the risk of transformation. How deeply rooted does your purchase on your tradition go? Does it engage your mind fully? Does it engage your heart? Does it engage your behavior, your ethical core? And there is certainly, and all three, one does not need to be a scholar to give an account of why, as a Jew or a Muslim or Baha'i or whatever, I have become the person I am through absorbing in various ways the teachings of my mother. Let me tell you one quick thing. Great essay in the Fundamentalism Project was by a rabbi named Chaim Soloveitchik, from the scion of a great rabbinical family from Europe. He's in America. And he said, in my lifetime, there's been an unfortunate fall into fundamentalism, by which he meant this. I grew up, and if I give account of my faith, I grew up in a culture of mimesis, meaning imitation. How did we know what was kosher? It's what mom did in the kitchen. You know, we imitated. We learned through behavior, through practice. That's often deeper than the ideas, right? But we learn this through a way of life. And it's an elegy, really. He said, what happened is after the Holocaust and the diaspora and so forth, we multiplied text and rabbinical learning, and the rabbi is much more important, and it's all about, you know, orthodoxy and super fundamentalism, and something's been lost. So it's an excellent question, because I think the answer is you can be deeply engaged in this conversation, but you've got to probe your heart, your experience, your memory, your history, the things that make you who you are, and hopefully some of that is erudition, great knowledge about, you know, these traditions, especially the multi-generational ones, are long-standing arguments made by brilliant people, by martyrs, by saints, by scoundrels, and they're fascinating, and they resonate with what you've experienced. But you've experienced it anyway, or something like it. So that encounter with those historical figures deepens nuances and so forth. But it doesn't prevent, the absence of it doesn't prevent you from speaking from your tradition. The real challenge is, I know for Catholics, over the last 30, 40 years, is a complete, if not a complete, not much purchase on any of that stuff. You know, the kind of loss of a kind of catechetical and formative tradition for young Catholics for all kinds of reasons. And certainly in terms of their intellectual purchase on the tradition, it's been kind of a wasteland, except in these pockets of very privileged Catholic colleges, universities, and seminaries, which only account for about 20% of the entire Catholic population. So it's a real problem there.
We're going to close the question time. I want, for students in the room, there's going to be a conversation tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. in the Rice Memorial Center. So for students, a conversation with the speaker about some practical ways of engaging in religious peace building at 8 a.m. in the Rice Memorial Center. For everyone, we have a reception right outside where we encourage you to engage in some more informal conversation about these important topics. This was just the beginning, so I encourage you to engage with one another. Thank you so much.